All right, let's dive right in. Today we're going deep, deep into British expansion in Africa, specifically between 1890 and 1914.
A really fascinating period. It's when things really shifted in how Britain approached controlling the continent.
Yeah, we've got a whole stack of sources here, historical analyses, first-hand accounts, even political cartoons.
It's a real mixed bag, but it paints a really vivid picture of how Britain solidified its grip on Africa.
We've got a railway nicknamed the Lunatic Express,
Oh, yeah, that one's a wild story.
a king who refused to surrender his empire,
Talk about standing up to power.
a botched raid with global repercussions,
Yeah, that one's a real head scratcher.
and even concentration camps.
A dark chapter for sure.
So it seems like we're in for quite a ride today.
Yeah.
But to kick things off, maybe we should set the stage a bit. I mean, Britain was already a major player on the world stage by the late 19th century. But what was driving this sudden urge to solidify their control in Africa?
Well, it's a complex story, but there are a few prevailing theories about what was going on.
Okay, lay them on me.
One influential idea is the peripheral theory of imperialism.
Peripheral theory. Now that sounds intriguing.
Basically, historians Robinson and Gallagher argued that British expansion wasn't about some, grand scheme to conquer the entire world.
So it wasn't about painting the map red, so to speak.
Not entirely, no. It was more about protecting their existing economic interests, making sure trade routes were secure, and securing access to valuable resources.
So it was more about the money than claiming land for the sake of it.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And then you have historian John Darwin, who takes this idea a step further with his concept of a pseudo-empire.
A pseudo-empire. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
Darwin argues that Britain was primarily focused on controlling key strategic points, places like the Suez Canal or emerging oil regions.
Ah, so it was about controlling those vital arteries of global trade and resources.
Exactly. These were crucial for maintaining Britain's position as, a global superpower.
That makes a lot of sense. But wait a minute. Our sources also mentioned something about food supplies being a factor. What's the story there?
Right. So historian Lizzie Collingham connects British expansion to the need to secure food for their growing population back home.
Makes sense. Britain was going through rapid industrialization and urbanization. They needed to feed all those factory workers and city dwellers somehow.
Exactly. So, Britain was increasingly reliant on imports to feed its people, and controlling territories in Africa was a way to ensure a steady supply of food.
So was British expansion purely an economic play? Or was it a bit of everything? Economics, resources, strategy, maybe even a dash of good old-fashioned imperial ambition?
It's likely a bit of everything, a real tangled web of motivations. But to really understand how it played out, I think we need to, zoom in on specific regions.
Okay, I like where this is going. So where should we start our regional deep dive?
Well, I think East Africa is a great place to begin. It's where Britain really started flexing its muscles and putting these different approaches to control into practice.
Sounds good to me. East Africa it is. So what were some of the key areas that Britain focused on in this region?
Well, we've got Zanzibar, Uganda, and Kenya, all fascinating examples of how Britain used different tactics to exert control.
Okay, let's start with Zanzibar. Can you give me a crash course on what a protectorate is and how it applied to this island nation?
Sure. Imagine a protectorate as a sort of halfway house between complete independence and direct rule.
Okay, so it's like having your cake and eating it too. You get control without all the responsibilities of running the place.
You got it. In 1890, Britain declared Zanzibar a protectorate, which gave them a lot of say in its affair.
So they were calling the shots, but Zanzibar technically remained independent.
Right. And to cement their control, Britain often installed puppet rulers, local leaders who were, shall we say, friendly to British interests.
So they're not exactly democratic or representative of the people's will, I imagine.
Not quite. And, when those puppet rulers faced any kind of challenge or opposition, they could always count on British military force to back them up. Our sources make it pretty clear that force was a common tool for maintaining control in these protectorates.
A not so subtle reminder of who was really in charge.
Right.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about Uganda? How did Britain establish a foothold there?
Uganda. That's where the Imperial British East Africa Company comes in.
Yes. Another one of those chartered companies, right?
Exactly. They were given free rein to, administer and exploit vast territories in East Africa. And in 1890, they took control of Uganda.
So they were basically running the show.
Pretty much. And to really unlock Uganda's economic potential, they decided to build a railway connecting it to the Indian Ocean.
And that's where we encounter that infamous lunatic express you mentioned earlier.
Yep, that's the one.
Well,
Officially, it was called the Ugandan Railway, but the nickname Lunatic Express tells you a lot about this ambitious and, frankly, crazy project.
what made it so lunatic?
Well, for starters, it was a massive undertaking. Construction started in 1896 and finished in 1900.
4 years to build a railway through the African interior. That's impressive.
It was. Imagine over 660 miles of track connecting Mombasa on the coast to Lake Victoria.
That's quite a feat of engineering.
Yeah.
But our sources mentioned a darker side to this project as well, right?
Sadly, yes. Building the railway came at a huge human cost.
What kind of cost are we talking about?
Over 2,493 workers died during its construction.
Wow. And who are these workers?
Mainly people recruited from India, drawn by the promise of work, but facing incredibly harsh conditions.
So diseases, accidents, tough working conditions, it all adds up. It's tragic.
It really is. And here's something that always gets me. There was opposition to the railway in the British Parliament back home.
Really? Why?
They were mostly worried about the financial costs estimated between £3 million and £5.5 million.
So the cost of human life was less of a concern than the financial cost.
It seems that way, unfortunately. It really highlights the skewed priorities at play during this era of expansion.
That's pretty disheartening.
Yeah. And this disregard for human life is something we see again and again in our sources.
The sobering reminder of the human cost of empire. Okay, so we've got this railway cutting through the heart of East Africa, connecting Uganda to the coast. But didn't it also run through the land of the Nandi people?
It did, and the Nandis were fiercely opposed to this intrusion.
I could imagine. Their land being carved up for a railway they didn't ask for.
Exactly, and they resisted, which unfortunately led to violent clashes with British forces.
Our sources mention the death of the Nandi leader during this conflict, right?
Yes. He was killed by the British, a tragic outcome. But, this resistance is something we'll see mirrored in other parts of East Africa as well. It wasn't just the Nandi who were pushing back against British control.
A sign of things to come, perhaps. Okay, so we've talked about Zanzibar and Uganda. Now let's move south to Kenya. What made it so strategically important for Britain?
Kenya, or the East African Protectorate, as it was known then, was essentially a crucial link to Uganda and the interior. The Lunatic Express running right through it made it even more valuable.
Ah, so it was all about controlling that transportation corridor.
In large part, yes. But it wasn't just about logistics. Kenya also had a diverse population, white settlers, a growing Indian population, and a large African population.
And I have a feeling those different groups didn't exactly enjoy equal rights and opportunities under British rule.
You'd be right. The white settlers got preferential treatment, of course. They were granted control of the most fertile land, the so-called White Highlands, often displacing native populations.
A classic case of divide and conquer, it seems.
Yeah. And we also see examples of the British using force to subdue certain groups, like the German-supported Muslim majority, for instance.
So anyone who posed a threat to British control was dealt with swiftly and often harshly.
Pretty much. And, just like with the Nandi, there was resistance to British rule in Kenya as well. In 1922, Harry Thuku led protests against identity cards for African men and tax hikes.
Sounds like a classic case of people pushing back against unfair policies.
It was, but unlike the Nandi leader, Huku was arrested.
So the British were willing to tolerate a certain level of dissent, as long as it didn't threaten their overall control.
It seems that way. It's a bit of a mixed bag, really.
Okay, before we jump over to West Africa, what can you tell us about Somaliland?
Ah, Somaliland. It might not have had a ton of resources, but its location was key. Right on the Horn of Africa, next to the Gulf of Aden.
So another strategic spot.
Absolutely. Britain established a protectorate there in 1888, mainly to secure control of that crucial maritime route.
It seems like Britain was playing a very deliberate game of chess in East Africa, strategically placing its pieces to create a network of control.
Exactly. They were thinking long-term, securing those key locations that would help them maintain their dominance in the region.
Wow. It's amazing how a seemingly simple desire for resources and trade could lead to such complex and at times brutal outcomes.
It is, isn't it? But that's colonialism for you. It's rarely a simple story.
And that complexity is something we'll see again as we explore other parts of Africa. But for now, let's take a little break and let all this sink in. We've covered a lot of ground already. Okay, so we've seen how Britain tightened its hold on East Africa, right? But what about West Africa? Was their approach any different in that region?
It's interesting because West Africa throws a bit of a different spin on things. It really showcases the role of company rule in British expansion.
Company rule? You mean like handing over the reins of imperialism to corporations?
Yeah, kinda. Take Nigeria, for example.
Okay, Nigeria. What's the story there?
Well, initially, vast swaths of what we know as Nigeria today were under the control of the Royal Niger Company, a chartered company, much like those we encountered in East Africa.
So they were given a lot of leeway to operate, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like their own little empire within an empire.
Exactly. Think about it. They had their own army, negotiated treaties, basically acted like a government in all but name.
But didn't that lead to some problems? I mean, too much power concentrated in one entity can be a recipe for trouble.
You're not wrong. The Royal Niger Company's methods were controversial, to say the least. There were clashes with local rulers, accusations of exploitation. It was a real mess.
So give me some examples. What kind of things were they doing that sparked controversy?
Well, the treatment of King Koko of Nembe and King Oba of Benin, for instance, really fueled the fire. Their treatment sparked outrage both in Nigeria and back in Britain, adding to the growing calls for the British government to step in and take direct control.
So it's transition from company rule to full-blown colony.
Exactly. In 1900, the British government basically bought out the Royal Niger Company.
They what? They literally bought a chunk of Africa. How much did that cost them?
Well, a cool 895,000 pounds changed hands.
Wow. They basically put a price tag on a whole region. That's pretty wild when you think about it.
It really highlights the transactional nature of colonialism, doesn't it?
It does. It's like people were just pawns in this grand game of empire. So after the buyout, what happened in Nigeria?
Well, both northern and southern Nigeria, which were previously under company control, became official British protectorates. And just 4 years later, in 1914, they were merged into a single colony.
So is that about streamlining administration, making things more efficient?
Sure, efficiency might have played a part, but the main driver was, you guessed it, economic.
Always follow the money.
Right. The North was running a budget deficit, while the South had a surplus.
So merging them was a way to balance the books.
Exactly.
Practical, sure, but not exactly what I'd call altruistic.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about Nigeria. But what about other parts of West Africa? Our sources mention Ashanti-land, present-day Ghana, as another key area where Britain faced resistance.
Oh, yeah, Ashanti-land. That's a story of real resilience. You see, the Ashanti people had a powerful and well-organized kingdom, and they weren't going to just roll over and let the British take over.
Our sources mention 4 wars fought between Britain and the Ashanti. That's pretty intense.
It was. The Fourth War in 1896 was triggered by King Prempeh's flat-out refusal to surrender his empire to the British.
Talk about a bold move.
It was. He saw right through Britain's attempt to, establish a protectorate and was determined to maintain his sovereignty.
The British weren't exactly known for backing down, were they?
Nope. Not at all. They ended up forcing King Prempeh into exile, and by 1900, they'd formally annexed Ashanti-land. It officially became part of the Gold Coast colony a couple of years later, in 1902.
Another victory for British expansionism. But was it all just about brute force? Did they have any kind of legal justification for these actions?
Well, this is where things get kind of interesting. Remember that principle of effective occupation that came out of the Berlin Conference?
Oh, yeah, that infamous conference where the European powers basically carved up Africa amongst themselves.
Exactly. Well, that principle essentially allowed Britain to claim territories where they could show, some level of control, even if it was initially through a company like the Royal Niger Company.
So, in a way, the actions of those companies gave them a legal loophole to just take over.
That's one way to look at it.
Clever, but also pretty sneaky. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in West Africa, but before we move on, I'm curious about something. You mentioned that the British faced a lot of resistance in Ashanti-land, right?
Right.
But why were they so determined to control this particular region? Was it just about resources?
Well, resources were definitely a factor, but there was also a strategic element at play.
Okay, so tell me more about that. How did strategy factor into their decision-making?
Well, Ashanti-land was located in a geographically important area.
What do you mean?
It was close to key trade routes and had the potential to disrupt British interests in the region.
So controlling Ashanti-land was about maintaining stability and projecting power in the wider region.
Exactly. It was about preventing any potential rivals from gaining a foothold and challenging their dominance.
It seems like every move Britain made was part of a bigger strategic calculation.
You got it. They were thinking several steps ahead, always trying to anticipate threats and secure their position. It was like a giant game of chess, with Africa as the board.
Okay, so we've explored East Africa and West Africa. Now, I think it's time to head north to Sudan, a region that seems to have been caught in the crosshairs of European rivalries.
Oh, yeah, Sudan was a real hotspot. It became a source of real anxiety for the British, especially when it came to growing French and Italian influence in the region.
So it was a strategic prize that everyone wanted a piece of.
Exactly. And the British were determined to control it, even if it meant going against the advice of their own cabinet.
Our sources mention a prime minister who was particularly fixated on reconquering Sudan. Who was this ambitious leader?
That would be Lord Salisbury. He became prime minister in 1885 and was deeply concerned about the expanding influence of France and Italy in the area. He saw control of Sudan as vital to maintaining British dominance in the Nile region.
It's interesting how one region could become such a focal point for so many competing interests. And this all ties back to the death of General Charles Gordon in Khartoum, right?
Right. Gordon's death in 1885 at the hands of modest forces became a rallying cry for British intervention.
A perfect excuse to justify a military campaign.
Yeah, Salisbury cleverly used it to drum up public support for retaking Sudan. But, his true motivations were probably more strategic than vengeful.
So enter Horatio Kitchener, a military leader who later gained quite a reputation during World War I.
Ah, Kitchener. A brilliant strategist known for his, let's say, direct approach. In 1896, he was given command of the Egyptian army and tasked with recapturing Sudan.
Our sources describe a railway that played a crucial role in his success. Tell me more about that.
Oh, that's the Sudan Military Railway, a testament to Kitchener's logistical brilliance. He knew that moving troops and supplies quickly was essential in Sudan's vast and challenging terrain.
So the railway was like his secret weapon.
You could say that. It stretched over 230 miles and allowed him to outmaneuver and outgun the modest forces. It was a game changer.
It's fascinating how technology, in this case, railway technology, became such a powerful tool for imperial expansion.
Yeah, it gave European powers a huge advantage, allowing them to project their power deep into the African interior.
And the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 is a prime example of this technological disparity, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a decisive victory for Kitchener, but also a brutally one-sided affair.
So tell me more about the battle. How did it play out?
Well, imagine this. Anglo-Egyptian forces, armed with the latest rifles and artillery against the modest army, who were, much less equipped.
That sounds like a massacre.
It pretty much was. Over 11,000 modest soldiers were killed, compared to just 50 Anglo-Egyptian casualties.
Wow. That's a horrifying disparity. It really highlights the brutal reality of colonial warfare.
It does. And, Kitchener's victory wasn't without its controversies.
What do you mean? What else happened?
Well, there were reports of looting in Omdurman after the battle, and there were even allegations that Kitchener's troops executed wounded modest soldiers.
That's awful. It seems victory often came at a steep moral price. But Sudan's story doesn't end with Omdurman, does it?
Nope, not at all. It actually takes a fascinating turn with the Fashoda incident. Remember how worried Salisbury was about French influence?
Oh, yeah.
Well, just as Kitchener was wrapping up his campaign, a French expedition led by Major Marchand shows up at Fashoda, a strategic point on the Nile.
So it's a showdown between Britain and France. That must have been a tense moment.
It was. Both sides refused to back down. It became a full-blown diplomatic crisis that almost sparked a war between two major European powers. Imagine that.
So how did they avoid war?
Well, in the end, France decided to back down, acknowledging the strength of Britain's position in Sudan. It was a diplomatic victory for the British, but it left France with a lingering sense of resentment, further fueling that rivalry between the two nations.
So after all that, Britain finally secured Sudan. What happened to the country after that?
Well, Egypt had its own ideas about what should happen. They wanted to merge with Sudan.
A unified Nile region. Interesting.
Right, but Britain had other plans.
Ah, of course they did.
They established Gordon Memorial College, named after the general who had died in Khartoum.
Okay, and what was the purpose of this college?
It was meant to train Sudanese people for eventual self-governance.
Sounds like a step towards independence. But was it really? Or was it just another way for the British to maintain their influence?
That's a good question. Some historians argue it was a genuine effort to prepare Sudan for self-rule. But others see it as a more calculated move, a way to ensure British influence even as they slowly transitioned away from direct control.
So it's a mixed bag. Bit of both, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It's a complex legacy that continues to shape Sudan today.
Sudan really shows how European rivalries and ambitions were intertwined with the quest for control in Africa, doesn't it?
It does. And it sets the stage perfectly for our next stop on this journey through British expansion, South Africa.
Ah, South Africa.
Yeah.
The land of diamonds, gold, and a particularly brutal conflict, the Boer War.
Yeah, South Africa really brings together a lot of the themes we've been discussing so far. Economic ambitions, racial tensions, and the lasting consequences of imperial policies.
It sounds like we're about to dive into a really complex and potentially unsettling chapter of this story.
So you're not wrong. And we'll be encountering some fascinating characters along the way. Cecil Rhodes, Dr. Jameson, Paul Kruger. It's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, well, I think we need a moment to catch our breath before we dive into the complexities of South Africa.
Yeah, let's take a beat to process everything we've learned so far.
Okay, so we're finally here, South Africa, a region that became a real focal point for British expansion, a place where ambitions and tensions collided.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how all those economic ambitions got entangled with those existing racial tensions, a real powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah, you've got the British, the Boers, the native African populations all vying for power and control. It's a recipe for conflict. But before we get to that main event, let's talk about Rhodesia. It's like the prequel to the main story, right?
Rhodesia. Oh, yeah, it's a key part of the narrative. And it's named after that ambitious Cecil Rhodes. Remember him?
Oh, yeah. How could we forget him?
So Rhodesia, initially, it was controlled by Rhodes's British South Africa Company, another one of those chartered companies with a lot of freedom to operate, just like we've seen in other parts of Africa.
Ah, so that same pattern of company rule that we've encountered before.
Exactly. And guess what this company was most interested in?
Let me guess. Exploiting the region's mineral wealth, especially gold.
Bingo. They claimed all mineral rights for themselves, making a fortune through royalties from all those mining operations. Southern Rhodesia, officially established in 1895. Later, it was merged with those northern Zambezi territories after a series of, conflicts.
Following that familiar pattern we've seen before. And what about Nyasaland? Did it follow a similar path?
Yeah, pretty much. Nyasaland later became Malawi. It was also under the thumb of the British South Africa Company until 1907, that is. Then it transitioned to a protectorate.
Okay, so we've got Rhodes and his company carving out quite a sphere of influence in southern Africa. But this all led to a clash with the Boers in the Transvaal, didn't it?
Right. The discovery of gold in 1886, the Witwatersrand region of the Transvaal. The Rand, that changed everything.
It's like someone struck a match near that powder keg.
Exactly. That gold rush, oh man, it just fueled tensions between the British and the Boers, those descendants of Dutch settlers who had, established their own independent republics in the region.
I bet the Boers weren't too thrilled about all those British prospectors and entrepreneurs, the Uitlanders, showing up and trying to get a piece of the action.
Not at all. They saw them as a threat to their way of life, to their autonomy. And then you have Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal Republic, a staunch defender of Boer independence. He was deeply suspicious of British motives, He viewed the Uitlanders as a potential fifth column, loyal to Britain. So in 1895, his government, they denied Uitlanders citizenship and voting rights.
And that's where Cecil Rhodes and that infamous Jameson raid come into play, right? It was a really bold move, or maybe just a desperate one.
Oh, yeah, a colossal blunder. Rhodes, he was the prime minister of the Cape Colony at the time. He authorized this crazy raid led by his buddy, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson. Can you believe it? Jameson and like 500 guys, they crossed into the Transvaal from Rhodesia with 6 artillery pieces, no less.
They're expecting the Uitlanders to rise up and support them, right?
Yeah, like some kind of glorious uprising. What a miscalculation.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. The Boers were ready for them. They were defeated quickly. Jameson, he was captured and handed back to the British. It was a humiliation for Rhodes, a huge embarrassment for the British government.
So much for that grand plan.
Right.
Okay, so this botched raid, what did it do to the already tense relationship between the British and the Boers?
Well, it basically threw gasoline on a smoldering fire. The Jameson raid pushed the region closer to war, the opposite of what they wanted to happen.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Right, and Kruger. He became a national hero for standing up to the British and the Boers. Convinced that Britain was going to take over their republics, they started preparing for war.
Which brings us to the Second Boer War, right? One of the most brutal conflicts in British imperial history.
Yep, 1899 to 1902, a real turning point in British strategy. You can see that shift, from that earlier, more haphazard approach to expansion to a much more calculated and ruthless strategy.
It was a long and costly war for the British, wasn't it?
It was. Over 400,000 troops deployed. An estimated 250 million spent. A huge investment of resources. And, of course, the human cost was staggering.
Yeah, our sources mention those horrific conditions in British concentration camps.
Those camps, a dark chapter. They were meant for Boer civilians, but the conditions were just appalling, overcrowded, rampant disease, mismanagement. Tragic, really. Over 20,000 Boers, most of them women and children, died in those camps.
Malnutrition, disease, neglect. Just awful. Those camps, they're a real stain on Britain's reputation.
They are. And, the war's legacy extended far beyond those immediate casualties. In a concession to the Boers, Britain agreed to deny voting rights to non-white people in the newly formed Union of South Africa.
So the seeds of apartheid were sown in the aftermath of this conflict.
Sadly, yes. The Second Boer War, a victory for British imperial power, but it paved the way for one of the most notorious systems of racial segregation in modern history.
It's a stark reminder that the impact of these conflicts can be felt for generations.
Absolutely.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into British expansion in Africa, it's clear this was a transformative period, both for Britain and for the continent of Africa.
It was. We've seen how Britain shifted from a more ad hoc approach to a much more deliberate and often ruthless strategy, using protectorates, company rule, military force, all those tools of empire.
It's a complex story, isn't it? A tangled web of economics, politics, social dynamics.
It is. And even after exploring all these different perspectives and theories, the question remains, what was truly driving British expansion? Was it just economics, a desire for resources and trade? Or was it something more, something deeper, maybe a need to project power to maintain their place on the world stage?
That's a question for all of you listening to ponder. We've explored the historical evidence, the different perspectives, the human stories. Now it's up to you to decide what you think. What truly motivated those actions? And how did they shape Africa, both then and now?
Yeah, as you reflect on all of this, think about how this period of expansion shaped the nations we see in Africa today. What if things had been different? What if Britain had adopted a different approach, a less aggressive one, a less exploitative one? How might the story have unfolded differently?
It's a thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
One that forces us to grapple with the legacy of colonialism and its impact on the world.
It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about choices and consequences. And those consequences continue to shape the world we live in today.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey, this deep dive into British expansion in Africa. We hope you've learned something new, gained some new insights, and maybe even come away with more questions than answers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those stories that shape our world.